Somerset, 1944. The farm gate swung open to reveal British villagers walking up the path, their arms full of vegetables, fresh bread balanced on top, milk bottles clinking together. The air suddenly thick with something between disbelief and fear. Across the orchard where they'd been picking apples, German women prisoners stopped their work, staring at civilians who had appeared during the morning harvest. They had been told what to expect from British population. Hatred, violence, civilians seeking revenge for husbands and sons killed by German forces. What happened in those following moments instead made every heartbeat in the orchard stop. A British farmer's wife approached the nearest German woman and simply held out a basket of fresh vegetables. No words, no explanation. Just an offering that contradicted everything they knew about war, about enemies, about how conquered peoples treated their captors prisoners. For a moment, 40 women stood frozen. Everything they had been taught about British civilians, about democratic populations' rage, about how enemies behave toward each other, was about to be tested against something they never expected: basic human kindness. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. So do me one favor. Tap like so this story isn't buried. Show support by subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video so more people discover the truth. History tried to hide. The journey to this moment had begun 10 weeks earlier on a grey morning in Hamburg. Greta Hoffman stood among 120 women in a bombed-out school building converted to a detention facility, her Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform still showing soot from the communications bunker hit during an RAF raid 4 days prior. She was 27, a signals operator who had worked directing fighter aircraft across 2 years of war. Around her, anti-aircraft crew members, military telephone operators, administrative personnel, even a propaganda photographer from the Reich Ministry who had been documenting the home front, all captured as Allied forces advanced and German defences collapsed in the west. They had expected immediate brutality, probably execution. The propaganda had been explicit. The British were barbaric toward female prisoners, experts at humiliation disguised as lawful treatment, skilled at psychological destruction through calculated cruelty. Instead, they received medical examinations, adequate rations, and transport to Britain in conditions that, while uncomfortable, maintained basic human dignity. The Channel crossing was miserable, but not sadistic. Seasickness that emptied stomachs, cold that penetrated wool uniforms, darkness broken only by naval patrol boats. Women sat in silence, some praying, others lost in thoughts about families they might never embrace again. Still others trying to prepare mentally for whatever systematic degradation awaited them in England. Greta kept a small diary hidden in her jacket lining, writing in tiny script when guards turned away. August 22nd, 1944. Crossed to England. The propaganda warned us that British treatment of women prisoners is worse than men. Systematic humiliation. Deliberate dehumanization. I will endure. I must remember who I am. The English countryside was different from German countryside when they disembarked at Plymouth. Softer somehow, rolling hills instead of sharp geography, fields that looked impossibly green despite years of war. Women stumbled down gangways onto docks where British soldiers waited with the professional detachment that seemed characteristic of everything they did. No theatrical cruelty, but no humanity either. Just efficient processing of enemy prisoners, according to established regulations. British guards loaded them onto lorries heading north. The journey lasted hours through landscape that looked impossibly untouched. Villages intact, churches still standing, farms still producing crops, everything functioning. Everything contradicting what propaganda had insisted about Britain being devastated by years of total war, about cities destroyed by V-weapons, about a nation on the verge of starvation and collapse. One prisoner, a sergeant named Anna Richter, whispered. They said Britain was finished, destroyed. But look at these farms. Everything still grows, everything still works. No one responded. The contradiction was too immediate, too disorienting to process during a single lorry journey. Camp 114 emerged from Somerset hillside like something from a different reality. Rows of wooden barracks arranged in neat lines, perimeter fencing that enclosed without threatening, guard towers manned by soldiers who looked more bored than hostile. The camp commandant was a British captain named Margaret Thornton, one of the few women officers in the service, who spoke adequate German from teaching languages at a girls' school before the war. She stood outside the administration building as lorries delivered their cargo, her posture formal but not aggressive. "You will be treated according to Geneva Convention protocols," she said in German that needed no interpreter. Her accent was decent, her grammar functional. "You will work on local farms during harvest season. You will be fed according to established rations. You will be housed appropriately. The local civilian population has been informed of your presence. They have been instructed to report any escape attempts. But I want you to understand something. Somerset farmers are practical people. They need labour. You need work. That relationship does not require cruelty." The German women stood in formation. Somerset wind cutting through inadequate uniforms, trying to comprehend what she meant. Local civilians informed of their presence. This had to be dangerous. British civilians whose sons and husbands were dying on the continent, whose cities were being bombed, whose lives were being destroyed by German forces. The threat seemed obvious, or so they thought. Captain Thornton dismissed them to barracks. The huts were basic but functional. Wooden bunks, wool blankets, small coal stoves for warmth, windows with shutters, and a common room with tables and chairs. Nothing impressive, but the absence of deliberate cruelty was itself disorienting. They had expected humiliation, degradation, systematic dehumanization. Instead, they found simple accommodation that treated them as prisoners, but not as animals. "Don't trust any of this." An older prisoner, Oberfeldwebel Margareta Steiner, warned immediately. She was 41, a career military woman who had served since the First War, who had survived multiple regime changes, who trusted nothing from enemies. "This is psychological warfare. They treat us adequately now, so they can manipulate us later. British sophistication disguised as basic decency." But the treatment continued unchanged. No deliberate cruelty arrived. The accommodation remained adequate. And on the 5th day, they were assigned to work details on local farms. The farm was different. It couldn't be anticipated. It sat in a valley 3 kilometers from camp. Stone buildings centuries old, fields that had been cultivated for generations, orchards heavy with late summer apples waiting to be picked. The farmer was a man named Thomas Barrett, perhaps 60, who had lost his son at Dunkirk and his grandson in North Africa. His wife Eleanor stood beside him when the lorry delivered German women workers that first morning. Greta watched them, expecting hatred, verbal abuse, perhaps violence. British civilians whose family had been killed by German forces. The propaganda had been explicit about how democratic populations behaved toward enemy prisoners, how rage and revenge drove civilian interaction. Thomas Barrett simply gestured toward the orchard. "Apples need picking. Work carefully. Don't bruise the fruit. We'll break for lunch at noon." His tone was neutral, professional, neither hostile nor warm, just a farmer explaining work to labourers. They picked apples in silence that first morning, 12 German women moving through the orchard under guard supervision, waiting for the cruelty, the insults, the humiliation. But Thomas Barrett simply worked alongside them, demonstrating proper technique, correcting mistakes without anger. Eleanor Barrett brought water mid-morning, setting buckets down without comment, without eye contact, but without deliberate cruelty either. At noon, they expected to eat the minimal rations they'd brought from camp. Instead, Eleanor Barrett appeared with sandwiches. Thick bread, real cheese, vegetable preserves. Not luxury, but adequate food prepared without obvious malice. She set the basket down on a table outside the barn, gestured toward it, and walked away. The German women stared at the food like it might be poisoned, like accepting it was a trap. Greta's stomach twisted with hunger and confusion in equal measure. Why would British civilians, whose family had been killed by Germans, feed German prisoners? What was the manipulation? What was the psychological warfare technique? Eventually, hunger won. They ate in silence, waiting for the revelation, the trick, the punishment that would make sense of this incomprehensible kindness. That night, Greta wrote in her hidden diary, "Today we worked on a British farm. The farmer lost his son and grandson to German forces. Yet he and his wife fed us adequately, treated us without obvious cruelty. I expected hatred. I expected revenge. Instead, I found something I don't understand. Is this sophisticated psychological manipulation? Or is it possible that British civilians don't automatically hate all Germans, that they can distinguish between us and the regime that sent us to war? I don't know what to believe anymore." The pattern repeated daily. Morning transport to Barratt Farm. Work in orchards and fields. Adequate treatment from civilians who had every reason to hate them. No cruelty, but no warmth either. Just professional relationship between farmers and labourers that ignored the war, ignored the losses, ignored everything except the immediate work that needed doing. Greta developed a working relationship with one of the guards. Not friendship exactly. Boundaries remained clear, but something approaching mutual recognition of shared humanity. Her name was Corporal Sarah Mitchell, a former nurse from Somerset, who spoke basic German from treating refugees before the war. Mitchell supervised work details with quiet professionalism. And one afternoon, while prisoners harvested potatoes, conversation turned to the treatment that dominated barracks discussions. "Why don't they hate us?" Greta asked. "The Barratts lost their son and grandson to German forces, yet they feed us, treat us adequately. Surely they must want revenge." Mitchell positioned another potato carefully in the collection basket, considering her response. "They do hate what happened. They hate that war took their family, but they don't automatically hate you. You didn't kill their son. You didn't order the invasion. You're just women who got caught in the same war that caught them." She paused, wiping soil from her hands. "German propaganda says British people are consumed by hatred, that we're barbaric toward prisoners. But most British people are just trying to survive. They don't have energy for systematic cruelty. They just want the war to end so they can go back to normal life." This conversation planted seeds that grew through the following weeks. Greta began observing more carefully, comparing actual British civilian behaviour to what German propaganda had claimed, and disturbing patterns emerged. Propaganda had claimed British civilians were starving, broken, desperate. Yet Somerset villagers seemed adequately fed, reasonably healthy, functioning normally. Propaganda had insisted British population would seek violent revenge on German prisoners. Yet civilians treated them with professional neutrality, neither kind nor cruel, just practical. Propaganda had claimed Britain was on the verge of collapse. Yet everything still functioned, farms still produced, society still operated. The transformation didn't happen uniformly. Some prisoners like Oberfeld-Weibel Steiner refused to trust any of it, insisting all British behaviour was sophisticated manipulation. Others began questioning obsessively, wondering if everything they'd been told was lies. Greta fell somewhere between, observing carefully, comparing reality to propaganda, trying to determine what was actually true versus what she'd been programmed to believe. In September, something happened that crystallized the shift for many prisoners. The Harvest Festival. Barratt Farm, like most Somerset farms, held an annual celebration marking harvest completion. Traditionally, this involved the farming family, hired workers, neighbours. This year, it included German prisoners. Eleanor Barratt appeared at the orchard one morning with an announcement translated by Corporal Mitchell. "The harvest is finished. Tomorrow we celebrate. You're invited." The German women stared in stunned silence, invited to a British civilian celebration. This had to be some kind of trap, some new form of psychological warfare. "You don't have to attend," Captain Thornton clarified when they returned to camp. "It's not an order, but the Barretts have extended the invitation. If you choose to go, you'll be supervised by guards, but you'll be treated as guests, not prisoners." That evening, the barracks erupted in debate. Oberfeldwebel Steiner insisted it was obviously manipulation, a way to break down their resistance through false kindness. Others argued that refusing would be insulting, might provoke the cruelty they'd been expecting. Greta remained uncertain. Why would British civilians, whose family had been killed by Germans, invite German prisoners to a harvest celebration? The next afternoon, 30 German women, including Greta, arrived at Barrett Farm for the festival. They expected obvious propaganda staging, carefully controlled event designed to demonstrate British superiority. What they found instead was simply a harvest celebration. Tables set up in the barn, local villagers arriving with food, children running through the orchard, musicians setting up in the corner. Everything normal, mundane, incomprehensible. Thomas Barrett stood near the barn entrance as they arrived. "Welcome," he said simply in English, translated by Corporal Mitchell. "You helped bring in our harvest. You're welcome at our table." The German women stood awkwardly at the edge of the celebration, not knowing how to behave, how to process this. British civilians were supposed to hate them. Instead, villagers nodded politely, offered food, treated them not as enemies but simply as workers who had earned their place. Eleanor Barrett approached Greta directly, holding a plate of food. Roasted vegetables, fresh bread, small portion of chicken, real butter. She held it out, making eye contact for the first time. "Thank you for your work," she said in halting German, her pronunciation terrible, but her intent clear. Greta took the plate, hands trembling, unable to speak. This woman's son had been killed by German forces, yet she was thanking a German prisoner for farm work, offering food, treating her with basic human dignity. When Eleanor Barrett walked away, Greta looked down at the plate, and something broke inside her. Not dramatically, not with tears or collapse, but a quiet internal shifting of everything she'd believed about enemies, about war, about how humans treated each other. Around her, other German women were experiencing similar moments. British villagers weren't performing for propaganda purposes. They were simply being themselves, treating German prisoners not as mortal enemies, but as human beings who happened to be caught in the same war that had caught everyone. The absence of hatred was more disorienting than hatred would have been. That night, Greta wrote in her diary, "Today, British civilians whose families were killed by German forces shared their harvest celebration with us. Eleanor Barrett, who lost her son and grandson, personally thanked me for farm work and gave me food. I expected this to be psychological manipulation, sophisticated propaganda designed to break our resistance. But I'm starting to realise I've been conditioned so thoroughly that I can no longer recognise basic human decency when I encounter it. If this is manipulation, it's the most elaborate deception ever created. Or maybe, just maybe, it's not manipulation at all. Maybe British civilians simply don't automatically hate all Germans. Maybe they can distinguish between us and the regime. And if that's true, what does it mean about everything else I believed?" The weeks continued through autumn. Daily work on farms throughout Somerset. Consistent treatment from British civilians that ranged from neutral to surprisingly kind. No systematic cruelty arrived. No humiliation campaigns began. British farmers simply needed labour. German prisoners provided it. And the relationship remained professional without becoming obviously propagandistic. And gradually something remarkable happened. British civilians began bringing extra food. Not officially, not as part of any programme, just individuals deciding to share what little they had. A farmer's wife bringing extra vegetables. a village baker including additional bread with the camp order, an elderly woman giving chocolate she'd saved from her ration to a German prisoner who reminded her of her daughter. These weren't grand gestures. They weren't orchestrated propaganda. They were small acts of humanity from people who were themselves rationing food, who were themselves struggling, who were themselves suffering losses, but they chose to share anyway. Captain Thornton noticed the transformation happening among prisoners. One afternoon, supervising a work detail repairing stone walls, she mentioned it to Greta. "I've seen this in other camps. Women arrive certain we'll torture them. Certain British civilians will seek revenge. Then they experience basic decency for a few weeks and certainty fractures. Not because we force anything, but because consistent exposure to ordinary human kindness makes propaganda impossible to maintain. How do you know you're not just better at propaganda than we were? Maybe British kindness is more effective manipulation than German cruelty." Thornton smiled slightly. "Fair question, but consider this. British civilians are giving you their rationed food. They're sharing harvests when their own families are hungry. If this was propaganda, why would we make our own people sacrifice for effect? The fact they share when they have so little themselves suggests they're just being decent, not performing." Greta had no response to this logic. It was precisely the question she'd been wrestling with for weeks. Why would propaganda require real civilian sacrifice? October brought colder weather and more troubling news. British newspapers began reporting details from the continent. Concentration camps being discovered, cities destroyed, civilian casualties. The reports were careful, factual, devastating. Captain Thornton made newspapers available in camp, not forcing anyone to read, just providing access to information that many prisoners weren't ready to process. Greta read with mounting horror, wanting to dismiss it as Allied propaganda, but unable to ignore the accumulating specificity, the photographs, the testimony, the details that propaganda couldn't simply fabricate. The barracks divided over this information. Some prisoners insisted it was all lies, that camps were labour facilities, that Allied forces were inventing atrocities. Others remembered things they'd heard, rumours they'd suppressed, and began accepting that something monstrous had happened in Germany's name. The arguments became heated, sometimes violent, until British guards had to restore order. Captain Thornton called an assembly one cold November morning. Frost covered the compound, turning everything white and brittle. German women stood in formation, breath visible in cold air, while Thornton stood on a platform with her translator. "You've been in Britain for 3 months now," she said in German. "Some of you have begun questioning what you were told about British civilians, about our treatment, about how enemies behave toward each other. That's understandable. You've been exposed to propaganda for years. Recognizing reality requires time." The prisoners listened, silent but attentive. "I want to address the concentration camp reports specifically because they cause the most conflict. British forces are not fabricating these reports. We are documenting what we discover as we advance. Camps where millions were systematically murdered, gas chambers, mass graves, industrial-scale extermination." Her voice remained steady, clinical. "Some of you don't believe this. You think it's Allied propaganda, that we're inventing atrocities to justify the war. I understand that impulse. It's easier to believe your nation couldn't commit such crimes than to accept documented evidence." She paused, letting translation complete. "But evidence doesn't care about what's easier to believe. It simply exists. And as more camps are discovered, as more documentation emerges, the evidence becomes impossible to deny. We report this information not to make you feel guilt, not to torture you psychologically, but because it's true, and truth matters more than comfortable lies. When you eventually return to Germany, you will see the evidence yourselves. You will walk through discovered camps. You will read documented records. You will hear survivor testimony, and you will have to reconcile what you see with what you believed. The question isn't whether these crimes happened. The question is what you do with that knowledge. Her voice softened slightly. These are hard questions, but avoiding them doesn't make them disappear. And the British civilians who have shared their food with you, who have treated you with basic decency despite losing family members to German forces, they deserve honesty about what happened. That evening, the barracks was quieter than usual. Women sat on bunks, processing information that couldn't be unheard. Greta wrote in her diary. Today, Captain Thornton told us the concentration camp reports are real. Part of me still wants to believe it's sophisticated propaganda. But I'm starting to realise I've been lied to so consistently that I can no longer trust my own judgment about what's true. If British civilians who have every reason to hate us can still show basic kindness, maybe they're also telling truth about what happened. And if that's true, then Eleanor Barrett, who lost her son and grandson to German forces, who still shared her harvest with me, she has more moral authority than I ever had. How do I reconcile that? The weeks continued through winter into spring. Work shifted from harvest to maintenance, from orchards to equipment repair. But the relationship with British civilians remained consistent. Adequate treatment, professional interaction, small acts of kindness that seemed to flow from basic human decency rather than sophisticated propaganda. In December, something remarkable happened. The Barrett family invited several German prisoners to their home for Christmas dinner. Not all prisoners, not as official event, just a small gesture from one family deciding that shared humanity mattered more than national boundaries. Captain Thornton approved the visit, with guard supervision, but made clear it was voluntary. Greta was among those invited. She sat at the Barrett family table on Christmas evening, eating rationed food that the family had saved, listening to Thomas Barrett say grace, watching Eleanor Barrett serve dinner with the same care she might have shown if her son and grandson were still alive to share the meal. The absence of hatred was overwhelming. These people had every right to hate her. Instead, they chose humanity. After dinner, Eleanor Barrett pulled Greta aside, speaking through Corporal Mitchell's translation. "My son would have wanted this," she said quietly. He believed that war was about governments, not people. That enemies were created by circumstances, not born. I don't know if he was right, but I know that hating you won't bring him back. So I choose to treat you as he would have wanted. Greta couldn't speak. She nodded, tears she couldn't control streaming down her face, understanding for the first time that she'd been given something she didn't deserve and could never repay. Forgiveness she hadn't asked for. Humanity she hadn't earned. Kindness that made no strategic sense in the context of war. That night, she wrote in her diary one final significant entry. Today, I sat at the table of a British family whose son and grandson were killed by German forces. They fed me Christmas dinner. They treated me with dignity I don't deserve. Eleanor Barrett told me her son would have wanted this, that he believed war was about governments, not people. I don't know if I believe that, but I know that everything I was taught about British civilians was a lie. They don't hate automatically. They don't seek revenge instinctively. They're just people trying to survive, trying to maintain their humanity despite everything war has taken from them. And their humanity challenges me to question everything else I believed. If British civilians can show kindness to German prisoners who represent forces that killed their family, then maybe humanity is possible even in war's darkest moments. Maybe the propaganda was wrong about more than I ever imagined. The war ended in May. Germany surrendered, and suddenly, after 6 years, all fighting ceased. At Camp 114, British newspapers reported the news with typical professionalism, factual, detailed, acknowledging both Allied relief and German devastation. Captain Thornton called an assembly, standing in spring sunshine that seemed incongruous with the moment's gravity. "The war is concluded," she said. "Repatriation will begin over coming months. Until departure, camp operations continue as before, including farm work for those who wish to continue. She paused. When you return to Germany, you will find a country destroyed, cities in ruins, infrastructure collapsed, food scarce. Many of you will struggle, but I want you to remember what you experienced here. British civilians who had every reason to hate you chose instead to treat you with basic decency. They shared their food when they themselves were hungry. They showed kindness when they had every justification for cruelty. That is the difference between propaganda and reality. That is what humanity looks like when it refuses to surrender to hatred. She gestured toward the Somerset countryside visible beyond the fence. You've spent months working on British farms, and some of you have received kindness from civilians who lost family members to German forces. That kindness was real, not propaganda, not manipulation, just human beings choosing humanity despite war. When you rebuild Germany, remember that lesson. Remember that enemies are created by circumstances, not born. Remember that humanity survives even war's worst cruelty. That evening, Greta sought out Corporal Mitchell one final time before repatriation preparation began. They stood at the camp perimeter fence, watching sunset over Somerset hills, listening to evening sounds from nearby farms where they'd worked for months. I need to thank you, Greta said. Not for adequate treatment exactly, though you provided that, but for something more important, for showing me that British civilians aren't what propaganda claimed, for giving me access to people like the Barretts who chose kindness over hatred, for not hiding humanity behind military necessity. Mitchell nodded. Humanity is the foundation of everything else. Without it, war destroys not just cities and armies, but souls. We showed you basic decency because we believe people deserve it, even enemies, even prisoners. What you did with that experience was up to you. What do I do with the guilt? The realization that my country committed atrocities while British civilians who suffered losses from those atrocities still showed me kindness I didn't deserve. Use it. Let it motivate you to never accept propaganda unchallenged again. To always question, always seek truth, always choose humanity even when hatred seems justified. That's how you honor people like the Barretts. She paused. And when you return to Germany, tell people about Somerset. Tell them that British civilians shared their harvest with German prisoners. Tell them that humanity survived, even in war's darkest moments. That's how you help rebuild something better. Repatriation began in June. Groups of prisoners were processed, given documentation, loaded onto lorries heading south. Greta's group was scheduled for July, almost exactly 11 months after her arrival. The final weeks felt strange. Women wandered the camp trying to remember it, understanding they were leaving a place where they'd experienced something rare, consistent human decency from people who had every justification for cruelty. The night before departure, many prisoners gathered in the barracks common room to write final letters to British families they'd worked with. Greta wrote to Eleanor Barrett, knowing she could never adequately express what the woman's kindness had meant, what it had taught her, how it had transformed her. The journey back to Germany was long. Ships across the Channel, trains through France, arriving finally in a country that looked like photographs of hell. Rubble everywhere, cities reduced to shells, people moving through ruins like ghosts. Greta returned to Hamburg, finding her family had survived, but their home was destroyed, their neighbourhood unrecognizable. That first night, in a basement shelter, Greta told them about Somerset, about British civilians who shared their harvest with German prisoners, about learning that humanity could survive even war's worst destruction. Her mother listened, as if she were describing another planet. "You trust British civilians?" she asked. Confusion evident. "I trust people who chose kindness when hatred would have been justified, and British civilians proved more humane than our own propaganda ever was. That's not betrayal. That's just recognizing what happened. In the months that followed, Greta found work with British occupation authorities, her language skills and administrative experience making her valuable. She helped establish food distribution programs in the British zone, working with both British and German civilians, who taught her that rebuilding required cooperation, that former enemies could work together, that humanity was possible, even after systematic atrocity. Greta became an advocate for British-German cooperation in reconstructing Germany. She wrote articles, gave speeches, argued that reconciliation required recognizing shared humanity, that rebuilding required learning from people like the Barretts who chose kindness over hatred. She told everyone about her experience in Somerset, about British civilians who shared their harvest despite losing family members to German forces. Many Germans weren't ready to hear this message. They preferred blaming defeat on military failures rather than examining how propaganda had poisoned their understanding of humanity. But some listened, and slowly standards for international cooperation began taking root in post-war Germany. Oberfeldwebel Steiner, who had never trusted British treatment, returned to Germany, still believing everything was sophisticated manipulation. She struggled in post-war chaos, unable to adapt, unable to accept that humanity she'd experienced was genuine. She died in 1949, bitter and confused, never reconciling what she'd been told with what actually happened. Corporal Sarah Mitchell continued serving in Germany through the occupation years, helping establish humanitarian programs throughout the British zone. She trained German administrators in cooperation standards, humanity over revenge, reconstruction over punishment, truth over propaganda. Her German students later became influential voices in rebuilding German society based on human dignity rather than national hatred. Captain Margaret Thornton rose to prominence in British military administration, specialising in understanding how propaganda worked and how to counter it through consistent human decency. Her insight was simple. Propaganda couldn't survive prolonged exposure to basic humanity. The solution wasn't counter-propaganda, but consistent, decent treatment. This philosophy influenced British occupation policy throughout the post-war years. What happened at Camp 114 and similar facilities was not widely documented for decades. It didn't fit comfortable narratives about justice and punishment. But it was real. German women prisoners were given work on British farms. British civilians whose families had been killed by German forces chose to share their harvest with German prisoners, and that exposure to basic human decency transformed many prisoners more effectively than any forced re-education program could have. Historians later noted that German women held in British camps returned home with transformed perspectives on humanity and conflict. They had experienced something impossible under Nazi ideology: basic human kindness from enemies who had every justification for hatred. This experience planted seeds that grew into post-war Germany's commitment to international cooperation, to recognizing shared humanity, to building relationships based on human dignity rather than national identity. The camp where Greta Hoffman spent 11 months no longer exists. The buildings were dismantled, the land returned to farmland. The Barrett farm still operates, now run by Thomas and Eleanor's great-grandchildren, who know the story of German prisoners who picked apples in their orchard. If you visited the site today, you would see only fields, perhaps sheep grazing. But the impact of what happened there ripples forward. Every humanitarian program Greta helped establish, every cooperation standard Mitchell implemented, every German who learned that humanity could survive even war's worst cruelty. The German women who first received food from British civilians expected hatred, expected revenge, expected cruelty disguised as law. What they received instead was something that challenged their fundamental assumptions. Basic human decency from people who had lost family members to German forces, who chose kindness when hatred would have been justified, who shared their harvest when their own families were hungry. And in that gap between expectation and reality, transformation became possible. Not immediate, not universal, but real. That is the quiet victory that no military campaign can achieve alone. That is the transformation that happens one act of kindness at a time, one moment of shared humanity at a time, one recognition that propaganda cannot survive prolonged exposure to basic decency. In the end, it wasn't British military superiority that defeated Nazi ideology in those prisoners' minds. It was the simple experience of receiving kindness from people who had every reason to hate them, of being treated with dignity by civilians who had lost family members, of learning that humanity could be more powerful than propaganda-fueled hatred. That is the lesson that echoes across decades. That is the truth that survives when propaganda is forgotten. That is the hope that remains when everything else has been destroyed. Humanity is not determined by nationality, but by choices individuals make. Kindness is not weakness, but strength that propaganda cannot match. Peace requires recognizing shared humanity, even with enemies. Even with those who represent forces that caused suffering, even when hatred would be justified. The prisoners who left Camp 114 in mid-1945 carried that lesson home back to a destroyed nation that needed to learn it more desperately than anything else in its history. Some shared it through establishing cooperation programs. Some lived it through choosing forgiveness over revenge. Some passed it on to children and grandchildren. And somewhere in that chain of transformation, Germany became something different than it was. Not perfect, not redeemed, but better. Better because people learned that humanity matters more than hatred, that kindness matters more than revenge, that societies built on human dignity are stronger than societies built on propaganda-fueled animosity, that in the space between hatred and humanity, reconciliation becomes possible. And sometimes that possibility arrives through simple acts of civilians sharing their harvest with prisoners they had every reason to hate.